I'm Bobby, and I'm from Oregon. My grandfather came in here with a wagon train in 1847 out of Missouri. We were slavers. He released all of his slaves, gave them all free papers, divided up the tax, even his own clothing, anything that didn't belong on the Oregon Trail, and they walked all the way from Independence, Missouri. They got here in the late part of the year, and they caused the Whitman Massacre. They didn't mean to, but they did. They brought chicken pox in on the train, Missouri fever, a whole bunch of different things that were unknown today what they were exactly talking about, but we know what the chicken pox was. And the Kalapuya Indians were very susceptible to it, as was the Nez Perce and as was the people up at Marcus Whitman's place where they had the ryegrass people. That group, the Cayuse, actually had different bands between Boise area all the way out to here. And on the way in, the wagon train had run out of food, and they were just across the river from what was then Fort Boise. There was nothing out there at all. There was no town or anything. But there was an adobe building on the north side of the river, Snake River, and they crossed the river, which is a pretty good-sized river right there, and found two Indian women working in a garden. There were no pony soldiers. There's no sign of any military presence at all. A couple of years later, a flood took the whole thing away. And if you go over there, down on the river, you can find a great big concrete lion-looking thing honoring the British because they were in charge of everything out here. They owned this country. They owned all of it out here. We were the ones that came in and trespassed. So we had to have a contract in order to do that. And that happens to be called a constitution. We'll get into that because there's three constitutions and always have been from the very beginning, but you never learned that in school. We were always told there was one. When Grandpa came out here, he was determined not to repeat what they did back there. They hated the slave economy. The British had set it up almost 200 years before that. It was all over the world by that time. And a few people in London were probably very wealthy over this thing. But it was disgusting. It comprised a total of something like 8% of the population of the South. So that means there was an awful lot of poor white people trying to survive with these giant plantations running around. And Grandpa decided he didn't want to do it anymore. So he sent his son out here in 1846 and his young wife. They didn't take a wagon. They rode with a pack horse behind them, and they joined the Donner Party. And they came out, they went as far as the breakoff where the Sierra Nevada Trail goes south. Half of the Graves family with the Donners, and of course they got into cannibalism and every other darn thing up there in the mountains. Charles and his wife cut across southern Oregon, and it became known as the Applegate Trail eventually, but they came up from the south into the Willamette Valley through Sheridan, Yam Hill area, testing the ground, sampling the soil, because Grandpa sent him out here. He says, we got to get out of here. Go out there and see if that Oregon country is anything like they say it is. And when they got home, they came right across the prairies in the middle of the winter in a blowing snowstorm. He said, it's better than they say. The soil is magnificent. It's green. It has a mild climate. Everything you could want. They hit the trail that summer. They all arrived at what today would be Umatilla. And then they had to make a decision. Because they had run out of food near Boise, and an Indian chief had showed up with a lot of food, named Chief Five Crow of the Cayuse Indians, who was a Christian. He'd gone to school at the Marcus and Narcissa Whitman School and had become a Christian. He knew the wagon trains were coming, but he had an ulterior motive. He loved Narcissa Whitman's hair color. Now, Indian girls always have black hair, or very, very dark anyway, and she had kind of a strawberry blonde hair. And he wanted a squaw with that color hair. So he had an ulterior motive. He's looking over the girls. Well, my Aunt Lorinda was 20 years old, and though she was actually engaged, she did have that color hair. He took note of that. But they brought food. The wagon train had a hoedown. It was a magnificent situation. These Indians came with food. They were friends. When they came on out to the valley, it was a while before they realized that half of the wagon train from Umatilla had gone up to the ryegrass place, had infected the Indians with chicken pox, and they had had a lot of death. The older people were killed. They died of it. They had no resistance against this kind of a disease. And it was kind of sad that they decided, because somebody was telling them that they were being poisoned, that they had to get rid of the white people. And there was a massacre, and something like 11 adults were killed. The wagon train was run by a guy named Captain Bewley, and his son and daughter were both there. Crocker, named after Davy Crockett, was tomahawked and killed. And Lorinda, right in the middle of the whole thing, Chief Five Crow rode in from the east, pulled rank on all the Indians, grabbed her, threw her up on the back of his horse, and rode off to the east with her, and no one ever saw her again. 53 kids were taken hostage. When it finally got down to the Portland area, the other half of the wagon train, who had been rafting down the Columbia River, finally arrived at Troutdale. And when they got there, Captain Bewley realized his daughter had been taken away and his son was dead, and he had a heart attack and died right there. His widow ended up in Oregon City, working in a rooming house or something of that nature. When the next year or so, we became a territory officially, and the year after that, in 49, they had the first assembly right here. I don't know why, but somewhere along the way, the family's never known the details, but Mrs. Bewley and my grandfather, who was also widowed, his wife had just died in childbirth, became an item. They got married. They didn't have children of their own, but their children married each other. So the Graves and the Bewleys dovetailed together, and we still eat fried chicken in the park in Sheridan every summer. I grew up as a kid listening to these stories. Now I'm one of the white-haired people telling the stories. It's just a family thing, but it's a little bit of Oregon too. Joe Meek, of course, was a mountain man that had been out here some time, and he kind of took exception to the fact that everybody grabbed a musket and was going to go kill Indians when they found out about the massacre. But he knew the Indian cultures, and he knew that they hadn't committed any crime in their culture. They raid each other all the time. And when they do, they steal each other's women and children. And it keeps the gene pool proper, probably. But at any rate, in their culture, it wasn't unusual to raid and steal children. He told these guys, the new settlers, you guys go up there with your muskets, start killing Indians, you're going to get them kids killed. You got to buy them back. That's the way you do it, because kids are currency. You buy them back. So they got all their pots and pans and anything that anyone would want. They went up there to the Jesuit mission on where the river that they're on, the Walla Walla River, runs about 7 or 8 miles and dumps into the Columbia at that time. There was no dams, and of course the Columbia was much lower. And there was a Jesuit mission there. The Jesuits are out here because this was British territory, of course. Jesuits are very active here. They wouldn't let them use the buildings, but they did let them use the front lawn to negotiate, and they bought all the kids back, but Lorinda was missing. Where's Lorinda? Well, there was 3 little gals there, the Sager girls, and their parents had died on the trail, and they were orphaned, and they'd been brought to the Whitmans, and they'd been living there. And the Sager girls knew that Lorinda, who was the oldest of them, had been carried away by Chief Five Crow. So she decided that they should know that Lorinda was off to the east. Eventually, they found her. He wasn't going to sell her. She was now his squaw. End of story, no discussion necessary. Well, the problem with that was that they weren't going to let it go. And finally, he wouldn't talk to anybody anymore and told his brother, you talk to him. And the brother said, how much you pay for all the other kids? And they told him, they had a list of stuff. He said, well, that's her price. Nobody would meet that. She was just a squaw. Come on. They did. They bought her back. Lorenda lived the rest of her life in Sheridan. She's my aunt. I didn't know her. She died before I was born, of course. But I've seen pictures of her when she was honored as being a survivor of the Whitman Massacre and all that kind of thing. That sort of thing went on out here as a territory, but already, even before they were not even a year old, this territory had to have an assembly because that's the way government was run in those days, and we've never even seen it. An assembly is the people, and that's where your republic comes from, of, by, for people. It's not some corporation like we have now. It's the people themselves are the government. But how in the heck did we get there? How could we ever get that kind of authority? It never happened in the world before, anywhere. In order to find that out, you got to back up a few years to see how come that took place. And I like to start with 1060 because at that time, William, who we call the Conqueror, was actually not a king at all, but a duke in a duchy called Normandy, which was a branch of the government out of Paris, because the Vikings had come in and taken all of that country 100 years earlier, and the Normans, of course, for the Norsemen, were given the West Coast as a district. It wasn't a kingdom. William was not a king, but his father came back from the First Crusade, died on the way. He was given the rank of duke of a duchy, but he was a bastard kid. The church did not recognize that the father and mother, William, and his father was Robert the Magnificent. And here's William the bastard. You know, you got to do something about that. That's pretty bad. But William had something in his back pocket. He had a trump card, no pun intended. He had been promised the kingdom of England. Now you got to realize that all these monarchs are related to each other because women are currency in those days. A king who has a daughter uses the daughter to marry the crown prince of another kingdom to bring the two kingdoms together. Doubles the money, doubles the number of knights they have. It's the way business was done. They had no political power. Women had absolutely no political power, but indirectly, through a powerful husband, they could exert their thinking. They could have money. And William, being a duke, not a king, had been promised the kingdom of England because Edward, the king of England at the time, had been pushed out of England in exile and was hiding out in Normandy because his mother was from there. She was a Norman. They were all related. Edward was the cousin of William. They were cousins. And Edward, while he was in exile over 20 years, the Danes had come in and pushed him out. When they left, he went back and took over as king again. And this guy Godwin, which was the power behind the throne, had done a lot of things politically for him. He'd fought the Scots and he'd fought the Welsh and he'd done a few things because Edward wasn't not a military man. And at the end of his life, he gave Godwin's son the crown also. And his name was Harold. So now Harold, in 1066, has become the King of England, when here's William on the other side of the channel over there, had already been promised the kingdom. So something had to be done about this. Well, he rounded up a bunch of knights. He got a bunch of boats. He took cavalry with him. The Saxons hadn't had to deal with cavalry. And at the Battle of Hastings, he pulled a very classic military maneuver. He fought the Saxons up on the hillsides until they thought they could win, That is, the Saxons thought they could win. And then he looked like he was retreating out onto the meadows and drew the Saxons out of the hills and out onto the meadows. And over the hill, he had his cavalry waiting. Zoom, they came through, and within a few minutes, the whole battle was over with. William was now the conqueror. And he's running around England, taking out all pockets of resistance, and he finds this old walled city on the Thames River that the Romans had built centuries before, called Alemanium. This walled city was too formidable to be bothering with, so he bypassed it. On Christmas Day, 1066, he was crowned King of England. He was overjoyed. He returned home. Now he's King William the Conqueror. And he had a lot of gratitude towards his army, so he did a very magical thing. He made all of them sovereign, and that was a big deal. To be a sovereign at that time meant that you're above the law. You have the same rank as any king. You pay no duties, no tariffs, no taxes, nothing like that. You are above it all. That was a big deal. In his army was this family called Belchair. Means kind face or nice personality. And the Belchairs became sovereign at that point. And the Belchairs migrated to England because actually William was the King of England. And he lived in Normandy, yes. But the Belchairs family spread out and eventually ended up in the colonies. Hold that thought because that's important. Well, William's grandson, Henry II, who expanded the size of his properties considerably, was doing fine, had a neighbor to the south, Eleanor of Aquitaine. I went to her house once. Magnificent piece of work, I got to tell you. Eleanor owned the south of France today, all the way across the south in the Pyrenees Mountains, down onto the flats, clear up to Carcassonne, the walled city. All of that was hers. She inherited it as a teenager. But she was a woman. She has to have a powerful husband. And she's looking around, and of course she's a pretty good, I would say a prize, because she was the richest woman in all of Europe at the time. And Louis VII, out of France, married her in a heartbeat. Good deal. They go off on the Second Crusade, which turned out to be a disaster. Saladin had taken the whole thing back. Wasn't looking good. And they didn't get along. She kept giving him girls. And if you're a king, that just won't do. You have to have an heir. And of course, it's her fault. So they came back on separate boats. She did learn something while she was there, though. She saw this unusual sea law structure called Admiralty Law. She had never seen that before. No one even knew about it. It was in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was a product of sea law that it goes clear back to Rhodes. Sea law is a process where ships at sea who fight each other constantly and steal each other's cargo all the time, and that's the way business was done then, had to protect themselves from paying duty if they lost something. For example, a shipper sends a ship out to sea with somebody's cargo on it, and the merchants lose their cargo because another nation's boat takes the cargo away. Then the shipper's responsible for the cargo, and that's expensive. So they got into this process of making a third party out of out of a ship. And a king did it later too for himself. What it is incorporation. To incorporate something, to give it its own identity, means that it can be dissolved. Now, today we call that bankruptcy, but it's just the collapsing of a corporation. So if a ship is a corporation and it gets into trouble and loses all of its cargo, they collapse the corporation and nobody's responsible anymore. Oh, too bad. It's not me, it's the ship, and it's gone. Put a new name on the ship and away they go again. So it was a long time process all through the Roman Empire. This was going on. The Knights Templar put it on steroids. They loved that process. They had armed cargo ships out there stealing everybody's cargo. Skull and Crossbones, that was their flag. We call them pirates today. They weren't pirates. They had some of the highest standing in the country because the Pope actually bowed to them. They had gone to the Holy Land, had gotten hold of something very important, and they were made like a sovereign. They had no duties or taxes to pay anywhere, and they became fractional bankers. They had a tremendously powerful military, and they had a big navy, and they're ripping off everybody. Made a lot of money for a while. They go to London, and they plant the Pope's flag right in the middle of this walled city that William made. He bypassed it and gave him a charter, and it became a city-state. And they claimed it on behalf of the Pope. So now it's the Pope's property. It still is right now. It's right in the middle of Westminster neighborhood in London, the city, right now. And it's never been part of England. And it's never been part of the UK. It is not British. It's Pope's property. He owns it. And as we'll see, it's the crown of England today. The monarch does not wear the crown. Elizabeth is not a queen. She never has been. Well, she was for one day, back in 52. How could that happen? Well, Eleanor of Aquitaine had to find another husband, and she married Henry II. And since he was now the king of Normandy and of England, and she had all of South France, together they owned a third of the country today. That is very powerful. Richest family there ever was there. And she gave him lots of babies. Well, he made her into a baby factory, put her under house arrest, and all she did was make babies, and that made her kind of angry. So when her babies grew up, and one of them you know quite well, Richard, the Lionheart, her second son, Richard became king when his father died, and he protected his mother and learned castle warfare in her defense in Aquitaine. Her house is over near the River Aude in the province of Aude today, south of Carcassonne. Beautiful house made of stone, 2 or 3 stories high, arches of stone, everything's stone. Big walled, maybe a 3 or 4 acre, I would say, garden area with a wall about that thick and maybe 14, 15 feet high, so guards could walk on it. She was a very powerful woman, and she had a lot of knights. It was very well done. They had root cellars built into the wall, down into the ground, places where you could see they would make cheese. Magnificent. Richard probably died in that house. He died of blood poison after an arrow wound after he came back from the Third Crusade. And while he was gone, she acted in his behalf, running the monarchy as a regent. She died about 3 or 4 years after he did. He died in 1198. And soon after that, the Fourth Crusade was organized against the south of France because the King of France wanted Aquitaine very badly. He had one time owned it, and now he wanted it back. And the Pope wanted to get rid of these pesky people down there called the Cathar people. He can't have those around. They're Christians with a different version of what happened at the time in the Holy Land. That Jesus' life was a completely different story there, and they can't tolerate that. Romans already have their own idea what happened there, and they made it up and they sold it. Hell, you know, Charlemagne ran all over with a point of a sword and spread it to Christendom, the whole of Europe. So, of course, they cannot have a parallel story. And that parallel story means Magdalene was Jesus' wife and had borne him a child after the crucifixion, and they had moved down there, and she continued his ministry as the Book of Love. And that's what the Cathar were about. And they were there a long time before Constantine started the Church of Rome by bringing Christianity into Rome. So they had a head start on them. The Pope had to get rid of them. So they did. The Eugenian Crusade, the Fourth Crusade, burned alive 1,200,000 people to purify their souls and get rid of the competition. And France got a whole lot of land, all the way down to the borders with Spain. Everybody was happy, unless you happen to be a Cathar. I went there to study them a little bit. I went to all the sites where they burned the people and all that, and I ran into them, and I found that they're still there. They just don't make a noise of it now. They keep their head down. I would too. It wasn't very healthy in those days. Pretty sad places to go. I climbed up on Mount Segura. I went all over the place. And of course, it was a very emotional thing. I found groups there. I was there at summer solstice, and there were groups there from other countries having prayer meetings on top of. It's a castle on top of a mountain, clear up in the clouds, and it's misty and wet and damp and very hard to get up there, like walking up a creek bed to get up there. But they've cut a door into the wall so you can go inside. There's no roof on the place. But there were people there having prayer meetings. I didn't recognize the language. They invited me. I don't know, maybe they were Finnish or something. I just didn't, the sound of their voices didn't make anything reminiscent to me. I think I would have known if it was French or Italian or any of the Romance languages, but this seemed something different. Maybe it was a dialect of Russian, I don't know. At any point, that history connected directly to Richard the Lionheart's family, who never lived in England, ever. He never spoke English, ever. He lived in France. He spoke Aquitaine, or Languedoc is the area. And his mother, being the most powerful woman in all of Europe at the time, he was probably pretty close to her. He learned to be a warrior. He was a gay man. He had a lot of pretty knights around him all the time, and he did have a wife, but it was always a joke among them that if he's ever to have an heir, his steward would have to perform the task. So, when Richard was finished with his kingdom and John took over, John had already been sniffing around. He didn't think his brother was going to come home alive anyway, and he was pretending to be king even before he was. And since his lands were largely in Normandy and, of course, Aquitaine, there was a problem in that John was not a military man and was hopeless on a battlefield and lost every single battle he was in. The barons who have to support him, which own the land, became very disenchanted with him. Eventually, they were completely pushed off the continent and had to retire to their own lands in England. John tried to raise money. He didn't have lands of his own, and he made a big mistake. You see, all crowned heads of state were crowned by the Pope. The Pope owns those crowns. If he wants a crusade, he says, I need a crusade. Boom. And knights must appear, because if you're a king, you have to provide knights. Only for 60 days, because they have their own lands to take care of and oversee their own people. The land people have to be overseen all the time. The unwashed masses get out of hand if you're not around. So a knight only goes into battle for about 60 days, and then he has to be released. So there's a constant rotation of knights. The barons decided not to support him anymore. And they got into a big beef about that. Finally, John, who's living in Windsor Palace and taking his meals there and living there and sleeping there at night, and all of his people are in tents on the side of a meadow out behind called Runnymede, and all the barons are on the other side of the same meadow in Runnymede, and they're having a diplomatic war. Who's overseeing the thing but an archbishop from the Pope's office? Because the barons have called the Pope, John has overstepped his position as a king. He's used the sheriff to collect taxes on lands he didn't own, on the baron's own land. He misused the office of sheriff. Now, sheriff, of course, came from William the Conqueror. When he came out of England, he had already seen this process of having an individual who was a liaison between serfs, or common unwashed masses, who actually do all the work, and the aristocracy, or the sovereigns, because they don't talk to each other. And in England, when he had gotten through this conquest down there, he saw this thing called a tappan man. A tappan man was an elected official from a cluster of farms or maybe a small village that was responsible for public safety. He thought it was a good idea. So he brought the idea back to Normandy, and he became a reeve. Now, a reeve in Scotland means a highwayman, a robber, because he did collect taxes, so I could see the relationship. But he also had the right to go to the big house and talk to the sovereigns, and then go to the little house where the land people live, and tell them what the big house wanted done from them, and collect taxes, and tell the big house what they had problems with down there. And he was running back and forth. The sheriff had a very high position, just about as high as you can get. It's like a provost marshal in the military. He's right next to the commanding officer. Nobody's below the provost marshals. That's like a sheriff. A shire is a county. And a reeve, a shire reeve, is the root of the word sheriff. In Scotland, he becomes a grieve, my family. In England, he becomes a grave. Graves ended up in Jamestown. My family ended up there as Greaves and then changed their name to Graves. But it means the same thing. Somebody was a sheriff once and they get to keep the title. Well, John had overstepped his authority and he had misused the office of sheriff, and the church saw to it that he had to be punished, and his crown was pulled, and he was forced to sign the Magna Carta. He burned 2 or 3 of them before they finally made one stick, because he really didn't like that. And then he had to sign the Treaty of the Wilderness, which is similar to the Magna Carta. It's even more detailed. I wish I had a copy of that. I've got the Magna Carta, is very available, but the other one, the Treaty of the Wilderness, which some people think is the Magna Carta, it's not. It's the second one. Talks about the rights of the little people. I think our founders were very well aware of these things, because it was in their minds when they came up against England again and France again. And you'll notice that throughout history, England and France was constantly fighting each other. They had the 100 Years' War that made Joan of Arc famous. They had the 30 Years' War. Then they had the 7 Years' War over in the colonies that we call the French and Indian War. They never stopped fighting. What were they fighting about? It's a family feud over land, because they're all related to each other. The ones that got pushed off the continent wanted to go back and get their land. So you got Henry V running over there, and Henry VI, and Henry VII. It never ends. It's just a family feud over land, but it's among sovereigns. John, having his crown pulled, died soon after that, and eventually the people formed their own form of government. Under the Magna Carta, they had the right to do that, and we see it as Parliament today. It came down through all of the descendants of William the Conqueror and all the king line until you get to Anne, early 1700s, and Anne didn't have any children. She made the British Empire by combining the United Kingdoms, by bringing their parliaments together and making one parliament to run the whole thing. And then she died, but the backstory is she ran away. She didn't want to be there anymore. But she went to the colonies and hid out and ended up in Oregon, believe it or not. That's the story, the backstory. But at that time in history, and that's pretty early, 1700s, she probably wasn't out here. This was a little wild at that time. And in that process, the Parliament was left without a head of state. Because you see, you have to have a sovereign as head of state. Nobody can talk for the country except a sovereign, because you have to talk to other countries, and they're all run by sovereigns. They're all kings. Kings don't talk to little people. There's no communication between the land people that do all the work and provide all the wealth and the sovereigns who use it all, sit around, chase the hounds and that sort of thing. No, you've got to have a head of state. So they went shopping, and in Germany they found the Hanover family being available, and one of the branches of the Hanover family came over and took over the job. George I, and then George II, George III, and George IV, and finally Victoria. They're all German. They wanted to change their name during World War I, so they became Windsor, after the name of the palace. Now they call it Windsor today. But it wasn't popular to be a German name during World War I. That's why the crown of England is not on the head of the monarch. Who paid for the colonies? Starting with Jamestown, the first successful colony, who paid for that? The crown paid for it. Who's the crown? The Pope. The Pope's bank paid for that. Who administered law and order? The monarch. Because the monarch's a lapdog of the Pope. After all, they work together. It's called Westminster. Or today, locally, they call it the corporation. It is incorporated. In our time, Margaret Thatcher had to, as a PM, had to go to the Queen and say, we're going to go to the Falkland Islands and take back the Falkland Islands for Argentina during the Reagan administration. Because Parliament decided they're not going to let Argentina do that. And they voted to go to war. The Prime Minister in England is not the head of state. It's just a liaison between the Parliament and the head of state, the Queen in this case. So Thatcher has to go to Elizabeth. They've decided to go to war in the Falklands, and the very first thing out of her mouth, well, we'll have to run that by Westminster. And nobody has a clue what they're even talking about. Westminster owns the money. They own your money in your pocket right now. It's the central bank system of the world today. The fractional banking that the Templars set up there is the central bank system of the world today. They run everything. They own everything. They own all the money out there. No matter what you call it, it's still their money. They're behind all the commercial banks. They own the Federal Reserve. I'll get into that. Glad you've asked that, because that's exactly the dilemma that we're facing. And they've purposely made it obscure to us to know. We don't have any money. We have military script. That's all it is. It's a debt note. But how we got there had a few more steps. Eventually, the kingdom became in conflict with the colonists over a long period of time. The problem was that France and England fighting each other was using up a lot of resource and eventually became indebted. And they tried to reclaim their debt by putting that debt on the backs of the colonists, because the French and Indian War was just an extension of the 30-year war, and England had won, so she felt in their wisdom that since the colonists were the beneficiaries, we remained British, well, my goodness, they should pay the bill. And so they had all these revenue-producing techniques they thought up. One was they charged an extra tariff on anything unloaded from their ships, which made all of our longshoremen angry. So they quit unloading ships, which made the British angry. So then they got into big conflicts. So we set one of their boats on fire. Oh yeah, that worked well. Then we had the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act and the Boston Tea Party, and all that stuff went on. Eventually, the colonists were subjected to a form of law that was just intolerable. Every governor of every one of the colonies, even though they were owned by the crown or the Pope, they were administered through law, the Bar Association, through the monarch. The British Accredited Registry, located in the old city of London, right there on Pope's property, is the Bar Association. And its franchises are all over the world. They gave the provinces, the governors of the provinces here, our colonies, the rights of a king. He could make his own law. Well, you know what? George III probably didn't even know we had a war because he was absolutely insane. He's running around Windsor Palace, kissing flowers, hugging trees, naked. He was an embarrassment. They finally institutionalized the guy. He died there. He never got better. So his son took over as regent, and we had problems with him too. But in the process, Parliament overstepped by pushing the colonies into the point where they couldn't recover. And in the more frontier areas of the colony, especially in Massachusetts, which was a really huge colony at the time, they began to rebel. And they went to their courthouses and they pulled those judges down out of those courthouses. They took their wigs off and they said, "That's enough of you," and made them go home. And they slowly worked their way towards Boston. And as they did, they got a bigger and bigger and bigger group. And pretty soon some of them brought their muskets, and that became a militia. And the next thing you know, they got the governor of Massachusetts in Boston having to step down from his offices and retire to his private residence. And you know what's going to happen. He's going to ask Parliament back home for some firepower because he cannot impose the king's law without some more regulars, redcoats. And everybody there knew it was going to happen. It was inevitable. So we have the Paul Revere ride. Of course, Paul Revere, it said, didn't even make the ride. He sat in the tavern so long that evening, he got too drunk, fell off his horse 3 times, and many people made the ride in different directions to tell the local militias to grab their guns and get ready because they were coming. And they did, and we had our first encounter. Now that was in 1775. So you had Concord, and you had the bridge, and we had Bunker Hill. Most of those guys didn't know anything about military. They knew nothing about warfare. They had no tactic or strategy at all. They fought from behind trees. Yeah, that did happen, but we were not at war yet. And you can't win anything against the biggest army on the planet that way, even though they thought they could do something. They became Minutemen, yes. Most of them died if they stayed in the front very long because the British were the most oiled army on the planet. And if you've ever seen that reenacted, you can see how it happened. The muskets at the time were smooth bore, not very accurate, and in order to hit anything, they lined everybody up shoulder to shoulder as tight as they could, and they would fire a volley. Somebody's going to hit something. And they drop to their knee and immediately start loading, and the next rank steps through and fires a volley. Drops to their knee, starts loading, the next one ranks. 6 ranks deep, boom, 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 boom. They just walk right through an army. That's how they did it. And there was no technology to stop that at that time. So we could never win a war against them shooting from behind rocks and trees. But there was a guy there who was, in fact, British trained. He'd been in the war with the French during what we call the French and Indian War, that they call the 7 Years' War. His name was George Washington, and he was very wealthy. He had a plantation with over 100 slaves, but he also had built a kind of a cash flow from the fact that he'd created the Missouri Mule. He brought in the tall jackasses from Spain, a tall version of a common ass, and bred them to Clydesdales and Belgians and Percherons, some of the big work animals, and created this very muscular and very inexpensive to feed thing called a Missouri Mule. And he became the most prized work animal of the day. It made him a very wealthy man. But he was a trained military officer. And he saw these guys, especially the encounter up at Nova Scotia, and he knew that these settlers got a heart for battle, but they just don't know what they're doing. So he went to one of our assemblies in full uniform. He says, "Let me take over as commander." And they said, "Absolutely," because they knew nothing about it. Well, in 1775, there was already a thought that they were going to have a problem. They had already asked this guy who was hiding out in the colonies named John Paul to do something about the naval blockade and the fact that any British army would have to be resupplied, and he was to go out there and harass the British shipping to keep the supply from happening. We gave him the name Jones later, but his name was John Paul from Scotland. He'd been a merchant marine captain, and he was a kind of a gnarly sort of guy, and he created a thing called the Marine Corps. So on November of 1775, they get together, and he gets a bunch of gnarly guys out of this tavern, and his idea was to take a fast-moving little schooner, because he didn't have any navy, he didn't have any warships, but he could outsail these big old ships of the line with a schooner, and he'd go ripping up alongside, throw grappling hooks over the side, tie the 2 boats together, and these guys would run across the deck with cutlasses and go hand-to-hand with the crew, take a ship away. And if he didn't like the ship, he just sunk it or set it on fire. He took out 2,000 ships. He even made a landing on British soil. is a pretty gnarly guy. You would think he'd be I'd say the father of American Navy, but he wasn't because we didn't have a Navy. While that was going on, George Washington is getting as many people trained as he could, and he hired a Prussian to help him do that. And with his German background, the guy knew how to train some people. He tried to make a continental army. It was hopeless. They just didn't have time because we had then, by that time, declared ourselves independent. The Declaration of Independence was formed, and the Declaration of Independence on July the 4th was finally presented. And that's not all that happened that year. Our history books stop there, don't they? No. They immediately started unifying the colonies into a single nation, and they called it the United Colonies.
What about the Treaty of Peace?
We're not there yet. Soon. We're just starting the war. What happened was they started assemblies. They'd always had assemblies in the colonies, but when they put them together, they created a document like a holding company. And the holding company, we call today the Union, a Union Trust, was the United Colonies, which became the United Estates, meaning people, which became the United States of America. All done in 1776, finished and ratified in September. 2 days away from the Federation, which was put together, which was all of the colonies like New York or Virginia or New Hampshire or whatever, became New York State, Virginia State, New Hampshire State. They added the word state on there. That's a trust. And the trust became a colony. A federation of the colonies. A federation is tight. You don't get out of a federation unless the other members let you go. It's tight. And the war was on. So all the time that Washington is out there engaging redcoats, we've got these founders racing around trying to keep from being shot, having meeting after meeting after meeting, assembly after assembly after assembly, trying to figure out how to make this thing work. They needed a central document, a constitution, but they really didn't have one. And every state or every colony offered one, except Georgia. Georgia wasn't real happy about this whole thing happening because she was selling a lot of cotton to Britain and actually didn't want to lose her market. Well, they boiled it down through the war years until they got it down to 3. And when they got it down to 3, Madison finally took the better parts of all 3, and I think it was Virginia and Pennsylvania and one of the others, New Jersey. New Jersey had a pretty good one. He put the best parts together, and by 1787, they had a quorum to pass it, but it was not ratified. Now, before that even happened, they had made a document called a confederation, because what had happened is they'd had this Treaty of Paris right after the war happened, 83, and the people who were there were bar members. Benjamin Franklin was a bar member. John Jay was a bar member. John Adams was a bar member. Yeah. And they had to meet with the Crown? Who in the hell are they? So when you read that treaty, and they talk about George III being the Prince of Peace, he probably didn't even know there was a war. Who they got to really deal with? The owners of the colonies. It's not the king. He's not even a real king. The Crown of England owned the colonies. So now we got a whole different ball of wax here. So they made a Treaty of Paris to end the war and hostilities, yes. And the fact that the war was won by the French in the first place is another story on itself. Because you see, George Washington could never have beaten England without the French. They supplied him with uniforms and muskets and cannon, everything. They had a liaison officer at his elbow the whole time through, Marquis de Lafayette, who was a very high aristocrat family in France and right next to Louis XVI. Eventually, though, Louis XVI added the infantry. He landed them on the beach north of Boston. They came overland, went all the way down to the Chesapeake, and they fought the Battle of Yorktown. They beat the war for us. They won the war for him. And then he was actually a subordinate commander at the time. The French were in charge and turned it over to Washington. So we owed a lot to France, and we would have had a bill to pay. We'd still be paying on that one, except that they had the revolution and all got their heads cut off, and we dodged the bullet. Kind of cool, huh?
Was the Treaty of Peace before the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah. In 1783 was the Paris Peace Talks and the Treaty of Peace.
And the King also,
We already had a confederation put together, though, in 81 before the war was even over.
was that ratified by the people?
No. What happened was the colonies sent delegates, and they were in assembly meetings, and they had these working groups that were making these documents, boiling them down into a single document. But before the war was even over, in the spring of 81, the war wasn't over till the fall of 81. In the spring of 81, they made a confederation. And the confederation was a business organization. It's a very loose type of thing. It's like a farmers' union. Anybody can, in fact, belong to it. We're at a point where I'd like to stop for a second or two if you want to grab another cup of coffee or whatnot, and then we'll get down into the Civil War. So what happens here is that we fight a war, and at the same time we have founders, our fathers of our American experience, dodging bullets and going from place to place, all over the place, to stay out of harm's way, to try to put a government together. And the business enterprise that they put together in 1781, even before the war was over, was a business enterprise between states. They all joined it, and anyone could leave if they wanted to. There's no penalty for it. A confederation is loose. It's like a farmers' union. You're there for business purposes, and it's called the state of Virginia, the state of New York, the state of. That's a commercial, kind of a business arrangement with which to do business on everybody's half. And if you didn't like it, you just leave. Nobody cares. So that's in existence, and if you count the document that produced the Federalist Papers about our history there, you could say that that's kind of a constitution. And then you're going to find out that there are 3 more constitutions, and then you're going to find out there's 2 more after that. So if you count them all up, there's about 6 constitutions we've been going through, and they're still there today. And all we were told about was what, 1? Ludicrous. Ludicrous. But that's what happens when you lose control of the information service. So, the Confederation of American States was formed in 81, and they met in Philadelphia finally because towards the war's end, the British had to abandon Philadelphia. Howe, which was the senior commander in New York, had to be recalled to England, and Clinton, who was in charge of Philadelphia, had to leave Philadelphia and go to take over Manhattan. And when he did that, Washington moved right in behind him. While they were going out one side of the city, he was moving in the other side of the city. It's kind of comical. But at least we were on our way then. And then, the war being finished, they had boiled this down to a single document that looked like it would be a good constitution, which really represents a contract. The Constitution is actually a contract. And George Washington had some problems to solve immediately. The Army had rebelled twice. They had attacked the government twice. The Marine Corps happened to be in town and protected the government from the Army because they had never been paid. They'd gone through all this hardship, Valley Forge, walking in snow with no shoes, and they hadn't been paid. I had a grandfather that was part of that. He was a sergeant. Well, you can't blame them for being annoyed. All these years of warfare, and they still hadn't got a dime. Washington had to have a loan. He needed the money badly. Now, the Netherlands had supported us, along with France, and so did Spain. But even though the money was available, he couldn't request it. He was not a head of state. We had no head of state. You don't get there just because you're a tough military guy or a king in your own mind. Ask Robert the Bruce about that. No, he was excommunicated. He couldn't trade with anybody. No, Washington had a real problem. Here's the money being offered, and he couldn't ask for it. There's no line of communication. We had no head of state. You have to be a sovereign to be a head of state. And we didn't have any sovereigns that we knew of. John Adams to the rescue. John Adams was living next door to a head of state, a sovereign. Belcher again. The Belcher family from William the Conqueror's time throughout England that had these giant 300-room manor houses with thousands of acres that they chase the hounds and drink scotch and smoke fine cigars that are above the law, don't do a damn thing, that created the House of Lords. These people migrated into the colonies. The Belcher family was here. They fought in the Revolutionary War. And James Clinton Belcher lived just a few doors down from John Adams in Braintree, Massachusetts. And John Adams knew he was a sovereign even though he didn't tell anybody. If anything, he was probably embarrassed by it. He says, "Can you help us?" Sure. Of course, Washington knew him. He was a lieutenant colonel. They sat down. He says, "What do you need?" "We got to get this money." Alexander Hamilton had been given the job to make a bank to receive the money, but we didn't get any way to get it. And Alexander Hamilton actually offered that those territories to the west that were not under statehood would make a nice collateral under that loan. They had it all figured out. So Belcher said, "I'll be your head of state." And he did. He requested the money. The money came in. The Army got paid for the first time, and my grandfather got $94 biannually. He was an old man at the time. It took him a long time to get there, but eventually it happened. But then, a most magnificent time in our entire history took place. Belcher, in honoring his own ancestors, decreed that all those who fought this, provided the manpower for this revolution, the Continental Army, will all be from this day forward a sovereign. And the only way you can be a sovereign is if you inherit it by blood or it's been decreed by another sovereign. It's the only way it can happen. You can't earn it on your own. And then he went one step further. All men born on the land, meaning people on the land, from this day forward shall be born a sovereign. That's it. That's where it came from. And when our nation states, and every state is a nation, in the Union, back in 1776, provide land, and people born on the land are, in fact, the government. You're above government. You have more authority than government does. Government is a contractor. And George Washington knew that. He had to get commerce going. So he immediately went down. He had this thing all surveyed off. It was 100 square miles at the time. And he put a corporation in there, the United States. There's no of America attached to it at all, just the United States. And it has a constitution, the Constitution of the United States. We still got it today. And their job, their contract, was to provide merchant marine service and engage in commerce in the world. with other heads of state now, because now Washington is a head of state. They even talked about making him a king briefly, which of course he thought was funny, because he didn't want to be a king. But he did want to be head of state. And now they had the job of running civil service. They operated out of the District of Columbia, which is sitting right on top of two state lands. And states are sovereign nations now, just like the colonies were. They were independently built. Maryland and Virginia. Today, a lot of Alexandria, Virginia is inside that original survey. Well, they had to do something about this collateral for the loan, so they made another corporation in the territories, and they called it the Territorial Corporation. And that's the United States of America, Inc. It's a corporation. It's incorporated. It commands territories not yet under statehood. And the Territorial Corporation and the Municipal Corporation in D.C., that is your federal government right from the beginning. But they're under the authority of the Union Trust, which has its own constitution, which is made up of the people of the nation states. That's what they built. It's an amazing bit of work, considering where they came from and that the world was all kingdoms. Look what they did. Amazing what they've given us. So, as a man or woman born on the land, you have the authority to oversee your government because they are subordinate to you. They are a contractor. They're an incorporated body. And it went fine all the way down to about 1860. And the Confederation of States, which was the storefront of every state, state of this, state of that, state of Oregon, until the Civil War. Now, we had the War of 1812. That was the last one the United States Trust was ever involved in. And that had to do with some aftermath of the original Revolutionary War because British sailors had deserted their post and gone ashore and hid out in the colonies because they didn't want to face John Paul, probably. And then when the war was over with, they are sailors. They went to work for our merchant marine. And the British, though, got into it with Napoleon about that time, and they really wanted those sailors back, so they saw them as deserters, and they started taking them off our merchant marine ships. And Madison at the time was angry about that, and he thought that to be an overstep and overreach, and one thing and another, he started the war. The War of 1812, we started ourselves. Plus the fact that Jefferson had thought that a lot of the people that had left that were British-minded had gone up to Canada anyway, and they were kind of our people. We could probably take Canada with little more than a marching exercise. Oops, that didn't work. The British came and defended them, and we had a lot of battles on the Great Lakes. We got frustrated, burned down their capital city, York, which became Toronto later. They got angry about that, retaliated, and burned down our city in D.C. Tit for tat. They went on down the Chesapeake, surrounded Baltimore. They landed infantry on the ground. Then they went down and shelled the fort there at the harbor entrance, where we got the Star-Spangled Banner from. That was a diversion. But the infantry that was encircling the city ran into the local militia, who was better trained by this time, and guess what? They lost. As soon as they lost, the naval blockade backed off, and Francis Scott Key wrote his poem. So we got a little something out of that. The point was, our nation, as a union, has never been in a war since then. What has been going to war is a different thing entirely. Because we had a civil war and it did not involve slavery. Even though slavery was used to emotionally charge the people, the real issue was cotton. What had happened was the Industrial Revolution had struck across France, had struck across England, and was in the north of the United States. And textiles was the gold rush of the centuries. Before that, material was made by hand, at best a water-powered loom. It was very expensive. And now they had steam engines making these great big textile mills, and they needed raw cotton, and they needed it now. And the South provided the world with cotton. And they had a monopoly, and they took advantage of it. And they raised the price and raised the price and raised the price. And pretty soon England was really angry about it. All the sails of sailing ships needed the cotton for their canvas. They decided to get some competition in there and bring these prices down. So they went to Egypt and they set up the Egyptian cotton plantations there. And then they went to India and made some more. And they brought the cotton prices clear down for a while. They had a crop failure. And for 7 years, the cotton out of the Middle East disappeared. And the southern plantations saw a chance to cut a fat hog here. And they were like OPEC. They ran the prices to the moon. And that made the world mad. The northern mills were mad. France was mad. England was mad. They decided enough is enough. So England decided to send an army into Canada. France sent an army into Mexico. And they invited Russia to take the West Coast back, and they were going to come in and take us over militarily as soon as they could get a war going between the North and the South. And they had to see how they could get that done, and slavery was a possibility when we were so weakened by our own fighting that we couldn't resist them. And they'd take their colonies back and put an end to this nonsense. The Russian Tsar, Alexander II, decided not to play ball. And he rebelled. He had been invited to the party, and he's the one that blew the whistle on it, or we'd have never known it even took place. That the Civil War was planned by France and England. All they needed was somebody to strike a match, and Lincoln was the favorite son. He was a bar member, and somewhat disenchanted with the law, the way it was working. He was dealing with some country places that were crusty, to say the least. I read some of his cases, and he was pretty dismayed sometimes with what he had to deal with. A third of the nation was illiterate. The rest were kind of surly and very physical. And he and Douglas used to share the same barn, sleep in haylofts and whatever else. But Lincoln was a conniving, very, I would say, cunning kind of man. If he was before a courtroom in Chicago, he wore silks and patent leather shoes. Oh yeah, he dressed for the jury. But if he was out on the road, on the circuit, in a buggy with Douglas, and they were buddies, he wore homespun. He wore work shoes. He wanted to always dress for the jury. He had a tall hat, kept all of his notes in his hat. He'd always sit there with his hands steepled like this, listening to everybody, and then he would bellow out and make some fine, fantastic statement and turn the whole court in one go. That was his style. He was a Whig, and you had more than one party at the time, but the Whigs, which became also known as Constitutionalists, were in the North predominantly, but there were Northern Democrats and there were Southern Democrats, and the Democrats in the South were slavers because only the plantation boys that had lots of money could afford to go sit around Washington smoking cigars, drinking whiskey, and being a nuisance. And they dominated Congress. So they actually made it impossible to deal with the slave issue because they muzzled everybody with the muzzle law. The only guy that could actually tear that apart, and finally did tear it apart, was John Quincy Adams. He was too old to be called into a duel. But in the North, dueling was illegal. In the South, it was manhood. If you didn't stand up to face another man's gun, you were not a man at all and had no right to even be in public office. That's the South, the gentleman's code. Yeah, my family was there. Fought the last duel in Washington, the Graves Silly duel. Silly was from originally Maine, but I think Massachusetts later. He spelled his name with a C, and he was a House of Representatives representative. And he was having trouble with people in the South, especially out of Kentucky. They were all Democrats. And the story involving their conflict and ultimately how Graves got involved in it, and eventually they had to fight a duel at 5 o'clock in the morning over in Maryland to get out of the district because it was illegal to have a duel in the district. Sent the sheriff on a wild goose chase so he wouldn't interfere. But neither one of them knew how to hold a gun, how to load a gun, or even how to shoot a gun. Even though my relative was from Kentucky, he was not a woodsman. He didn't know anything about guns. They had to have a committee load the guns. And then they paced off 15 paces with muskets. And the first time around, Silly's gun misfired because the way you did a duel, you had a referee. And you had seconds, of course. There were 30 people there from Congress watching this thing. And the referee would raise his hand and say, "Ready, fire! 1, 2, 3, 4, ceasefire." If nobody had fired in that length of time, "Are you satisfied? Are you satisfied?" No satisfaction? Round 2. And that's what happened. Silly's gun misfired on the first go. They did the guns, reloaded them. These are muzzle loaders. "Ready, fire! 1, boom." Graves, lifting his gun, almost shot his toe off, blew a hole in the sod right in front of him, touched the trigger too soon. These people were inept. But on the third round, they both shot at the same time, and Graves shot Silly, hit an artery, and he died in a few seconds, which was devastating to Graves because they were the best of friends, and they were both Whigs. They got caught up in this gentleman's code thing. It's all in the Library of Congress. You can read the whole thing. There's a nice book out there called Field of Blood, which is about our Congress between 1930 and the Civil War, and you should get it sometime. Magnificent job, taken from the record keeper, a guy named French, that had an office just below Speaker of the House. He recorded everything that took place, but he kept a private diary. And so the stuff he couldn't put in the congressional record because it was too seamy, he put in his diary. Now he's got an encyclopedia diary that's now in the Library of Congress that tells you what really went on in the House of Representatives, and it's a riot to read. It's a riot. Unbelievable stuff that went on there. They fired a gun across the House. There was a war going on from time to time, and all the newspapers would invite everybody from all around to come see Congress. They're going to have a battle. They're going to have a gunfight on the steps of Congress. Yeah, that's what they were doing, selling papers. Well, the British were observing this. They could see that those men from the South were really different than the ones from the North, and they didn't really like each other much. That they could use this slavery thing. It was a hot emotional item, and they might be able to get us to fight each other over it. All they had to do was just study it a little bit. So they sent people in to observe. Charles Dickens was sent in 1832. He was given an honorary seat in the House of Representatives, and he wrote at length about what he saw there, and you should read it. It is a riot. "I dare say I have never seen anything so chaotic in my entire life. Everybody's shouting at the same time, and there's papers all over the floor. People are spitting tobacco at the spittoons and missing them all the time, and the carpet is completely saturated. I dare say, if I were to retrieve a paper from the floor, I would not do so without the protection of a gloved hand. Everybody's drunk. Some guy named Calhoun's got the floor, South Carolina. But he's shouting at the ceiling. He's bent backwards across his desk, so intoxicated he cannot stand erect." This is our Congress, 1830s. 6 bars existed in Congress, and everybody's drinking all the time. A former prime minister went, 1850s. I read his report. It is the most abominable scene I have ever seen in my life. The people from the North and the people from the South hate each other. And the boys from the South sit back with their feet on their desks, smoking cigars, muskets leaning against the tables, and dogs are sleeping under the table. If somebody decided to vote against a bill that the South thought was important, they'd grab the guy, take him into an anteroom, stick a Bowie knife under his chin, and make him change his vote. On the way to their hotels, they would cane each other. At times, they broke chairs over each other's heads. That's our Congress before the Civil War. Wild and woolly. But obviously, from somebody outside looking for a niche in our armor, they could see that this is something could be exploited. Lincoln to the rescue. He's got a bronze statue over in the old city of London, Westminster. Funny how that happens, huh? We don't know who he was. We really don't. We think we do, because he's been made to walk on water by historians, but it's not really the case if you really read him. What he did, everything he did to get that war going, was he went out of his way. And the Confederation that had been built back in 1781 was divided against itself. The Southerners had walked out of Congress because Lincoln corporatized the place. And in doing so, he called Congress himself, and then made Congress declare an allegiance to the municipal corporation, the one in D.C., that George Washington had created. And then he sent goon squads all over, arresting anybody that wrote anything against what his policies were. So he arrested over 12,000 people, put them in a military prison, suspended habeas corpus with the excuse that it was necessary emergency. So he used the same old game, emergency clauses, to take over the government, and he was virtually a dictator. He was never the president of the republic. The republic president died with Buchanan, and Oregon was the last state in. After that, it was no longer our government. It was a series of corporations run amok. They say that Lincoln had a change of heart in the middle of the war when he saw Gettysburg. He was physically sickened by it. Some thought he had the flu. He realized he'd been used, I think. There was a lot of things about him that were a mystery. The Wilkes Booth family has a completely different story of the assassination, however. John Wilkes Booth did not die there. He made it all the way back to Florida, where he has 5 great-grandchildren living there right now. And they, in the 90s, wrote quite a bit of stories about what their family knew about the assassination. It was Mary Todd that shot her husband behind the ear with the Derringer. We got to make another movement here. Anybody need a break?
My name is Michael. I did not sell or agree to give up my constitutional rights at any time. I require you or anyone else to provide the evidence of which you rely on. Since you cannot provide anywhere in congressional record the evidence of 3 ratified constitutions and memorialization anywhere where we the people created, I can only come to the conclusion that you are perpetuating a fraud, indivisible interests to and contrary to consent of the governed. But I appreciate your historical perspective, and I thank you very much.
And I'll answer you. I have all 3 of them. All those constitutions in my possession. I also have the Declaration of Interdependence. We've got to get to that yet. We're not there yet. We're not there yet. But we soon will be. There are 6 constitutions involved here, if you count the Confederation in 81. There are 6 of them. Now, the ones that were ratified in 1787, which was the Union Trust Constitution, was out of print and hidden since they burned Washington down during the War of 1812, and they claimed that it didn't exist. However, a lord from England happened to have been here when that happened and took those documents back to England, and it was in a cache in his library. And that library fell into a descendant later on. And he found these documents taken from 1787 and asked us if we'd like one. Because I tried for years to get the OCLU or any of those people give me a real constitution for the United States of America, but nobody had one. And they finally wrote me a letter and said, lots of luck with that one, as though it didn't exist anymore. However, I've got it. because this Lord gave us this Constitution, and we've printed it out, and every one of our people in all of our assemblies have it. I have a copy of the Municipal Constitution of the United States. It's now done in capital letters. Where did these come from, and why are they there? Because the government is a corporation, incorporated to do business for the trust. And you, as a person, a sovereign on the land, control the whole thing if you knew about it. But something happened so that you wouldn't know about it, and that's the rest of our story. What happened was the United States got into a civil war, yes. And Lincoln ran out of money in 1863, yes. He went to Gettysburg early in the year and was devastated by what he saw there. And he went back home, and within 60 days, he had composed General Order 100. And he gave it to the Army, and it produced what we know today as the Hague Convention, the first ever executive order. There's no such thing as an executive order in a republic. The president doesn't have that kind of power. But under the emergency clause, Lincoln had seized this power, and it was virtually a dictator at the time. The Southerners that had walked out of Congress had destroyed the Confederation because they had no quorum anymore. They had gone home. Jefferson Davis went back to Mississippi disenchanted because of what Lincoln was doing. He tried and tried and tried to sit down with Lincoln. He wouldn't hear him. Lincoln was working for a different boss. We don't know the details. I wish I could find documents to prove that, but I know he was working for somebody else. And then he had a change of heart. He decided somebody was using him. And it's obvious that France and England were working very hard to get this thing going. They wanted this thing to collapse. They didn't get it done militarily, so they tried another act. He went bankrupt. The very next day after he issued General Order 100, he bankrupted both of the federal corporations, the municipal and the territorial. Now these contracts, which are actually constitutions or contracts, the municipal contract was with the Holy See through the Lord Mayor of London. Remember, the colonies were owned by the Lord Mayor of London, but the Lord Mayor of London, which is a king in himself, is a lapdog of the Pope's office. The central bank system comes from there. The territorial actually was owned by the monarch of England because she claimed all the land before the wagon trains came out here. That's why the British were here when we got here. John McLaughlin didn't happen to come into Portland, Vancouver area because he thought it was a nice country. He was working for the Hudson Bay Company. They were running, chasing after pelts, of course, and things of that nature, and they had a lot of Frenchmen out here. But England claimed this land, and on the very west coast it had been claimed by other people. Russia had a claim on it at one time. And the Spanish had a claim on it during the Spanish Main period. We got shipwrecks all up and down our coast because of that. They were here for 200 years. So when you look at the whole picture, you see that the wagon trains coming out here were running onto other people's lands. And a territorial corporation was a contract to occupy that land. It was a condition of the Northwest Treaty. And the Northwest at that time was Ohio. And it allowed us to actually have access to land that other people already claimed. Now, the Pope already had the world given to him back in the Crusade period. He was the trustee of the global estate, the jurisdiction of air. He was in charge of all incorporated acts on the planet, and he was the one that could take away a crown. But he can also close a corporation with a snap of his finger, and he has an army of people to do that with. Every state has a vicar general. He works for the Pope. He's right up there on the east side of Burnside right now for Oregon. Every state has one. Will he do it? Probably not. They like the revenue stream they're getting from our corporate government. But what actually happened, was that those territorial and municipal corporations were taken over by the people they had contracts with. The British came in 1868 and reformed the United States Territorial Corporation. It's called the United States of America. They respelled it a little different. It's not quite the same spelling, but nothing that you would notice. But it's owned by the British. And that takes care of our military. Because our military, UCMJ, everything comes under the Territorial Corporation. Then you have the Wall Street and all your banking system under the municipal. And the Holy See came in and reorganized that, and that's been belonging to the Holy See. And the United States of America became a corporation incorporated in Scotland, in Edinburgh. That's what happened. We didn't reform our government. The Confederation fought itself, destroyed itself, and we didn't do anything about it. So they came in and reorganized it for us. And they still own it today, except that it's gone through 4 bankruptcies now. The first one in 1863, the second one starting in 1895 or 6, and finally concluding in 1907. And then another one, because of the crash of 29, and this is forced on you. It isn't something you choose to do. The Community of Nations decides whether or not you're going to go bankrupt. And we were insolvent after the crash of 29, and our delegate was sent to the conventions to be told by the rest of the Community of Nations that now you got to go through Chapter 7 again. And our delegate happened to be Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And magically he became president a couple of years later and did just that. Bankrupted the country again in 1933. Then we had a Wall Street crash in, 2008, and now we've got another bankruptcy that has just concluded itself this month. Bankruptcy after bankruptcy after bankruptcy is just the closing or the collapsing of the corporations pretending to be your government. They're not yours anymore because we gave them up back in the 1860s. In 1878, the municipal one was completed, but there was a problem there. Now you've got a foreign government sitting on sovereign land. You've got to do something about that. The District of Columbia is sitting on Maryland and Virginia. Internationally, that's not allowed. So the Grant administration had to do something about that. So he gets busy. I'm sure that Ulysses S. Grant was an idiot. I don't think he probably knew enough about politics, but he was used by everybody around him. And they decided in 1871 to move Washington out of the country. It didn't work. It blew back on them. So they chopped it up in little pieces and they moved it to Puerto Rico. The District of Columbia was reduced in size to about 1 square mile and belongs to Puerto Rico right now. The people in Washington, D.C. could not vote when I was a kid. They're in a foreign country, completely owned by the Pope. Do they want you to know about that? Of course not. Because they're now in a position to manipulate taxes, and that revenue stream runs right offshore. They never had it so good. America is a very wealthy country, and they're sucking us dry. But they don't have the right to even touch the Union Trust. That's not incorporated. And the Federation, that's not incorporated either. And the nations that we think of as state of this or state of that, which are nothing but franchises of now a bankrupted corporation, is not the same as Oregon State, Washington State, California State. Those are federations, and they are nations apart. They belong to the Union, yes, but they're run by the people. And persons and people are not the same thing. A person is a corporation, and a people is a living soul, a living man and a living woman. And the founders knew that. They knew that because this business of bastardizing a language and hiding its meaning from the people go clear back to Justinian of Rome. He did that. He'd take 2 words that mean opposite things, put them together to make a single word, and then they could decide which way they wanted to go. But the people didn't know. So nobody knows that They're a corporation today. You've all been incorporated. You didn't even see it coming because it's a birth certificate that did it. And you don't even know that. There's 3 major corporations under everybody. You're not a living person anymore. You're a dead entity, according to the law. And they can buy and sell dead entities all they want because that's not violating the human trafficking thing that's been over 200 years in the making of buying and selling living people. No, you're a corporation under the law. And the law from Britain, run by the Bar Association, is sea law, admiralty law, sea law. And sea law can only deal with corporations, corporate to corporate to corporate to corporate to corporate. It cannot deal with a living man or a living woman. It's across their jurisdictional lines. But nobody knows that. And we don't have any courtrooms running that are not sea law courts. They're all sea law courts. And under Franklin Roosevelt, they became administrative courts. The judges aren't really judges at all. They're CEOs of a corporation. All been hidden from the people. And they're all beneath you as a sovereign. You have more authority in your little finger than any of them do together. But the reality is they have more guns than you do, and all law is forced on you with either a heavy club, a sharp, pointy stick, an edged weapon, or the muzzle of a weapon. It's forced on you. So the problem we have today is that they outnumber us. Not many people know about what an assembly is. And how you become a member of the assembly is you have to take yourself back to being an American again. Because you're not. You're a British Commonwealth subject under the law. The Queen and the Pope together, and the Queen is in the Pope's lap, so it's really the Pope fighting on both sides of the issue, owns everything, and not just this country, all the countries, because he owns the money. And while our Constitution at our founders' side said gold and silver are the only thing that makes money, they knew what they were talking about. They'd seen this paper, plastic money forever. It goes clear back to Genoa. But the Federal Reserve was put in because during the 1907 bankruptcy, J.P. Morgan and his rich buddies reorganized the thing, and it told everybody they were just saving us by paying off some debts and replenishing Wall Street and putting gold back in circulation, blah, 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 blah. They'd satisfied the bankruptcy. Now, there's been people out there who have a lot of information, and they've tried to tell us over the years, but it's dangerous. A man in England in the 1850s became very interested in telling the people what was going on. In England, there's no protection for that, and if you speak against the government, you can get your head cut off. He wrote a book in the form of a children's book, and he's talking about his own country. Alice in Wonderland. The monarchy is a house of cards. Everything is not what you think it is. Nothing is as it appears. Big is little, little is big. Up is down, black is white. And there's always the Jabberwocky through the looking glass that'll come get you. Because they have death squads everywhere, and they always have had. So if anybody gets too big and too uppity, something happens to them, like John F. Kennedy. I worked with Lee Harvey Oswald. And believe me, there's 2 people. That's not one person. There's 2 people there. How many people know that? There's Lee Oswald, which is in Pendleton, and there's Harvey Oswald that was with me over in Atsugi, Japan. He was in MAX 1, military air controller, a Marine air control unit. Harvey Oswald didn't know anything about politics at all. Lee Oswald did. He's the one they shot in Dallas. Did anyone ask the Marine Corps about this? Not even once. They didn't want to even ask the question because they already made up the whole thing for the public to see. This is the guy who did it. He was the patsy. The Wilkes-Booth family say the same thing. John Wilkes-Booth was a patsy. The Naval Department decided to show the country what Lincoln really was. They were going to take him aboard a ship, take him out to sea for a couple of months on a victory cruise, shoot him up with opium to the point where he was delirious, and dump him on the streets of D.C. so the people could see what they really had for a president. That's what they told John Wilkes. Trouble is, John Wilkes found out about it at the last minute. He was supposed to chloroform the president, take him down to a wagon, take him to a ship. When he got up the back stairway of the Ford Theater, according to the family story, the door was open to the box. There was a naval officer and his wife in front. The Lincolns were in the back. Abraham was sound asleep on his wife's shoulder, and she had a derringer behind his ear. She was looking at the door. When the door had opened up and he was there, she shot him through the back of the head. He realized he'd been set up. The Naval Department was going to arrest him for the assassination. He jumped off onto the stage, broke his leg, got away, and a guy in a barn, who they said was him, got buried in his grave today. They tried to exhume the body, and the government wouldn't let them. In the 1990s. It's all coming out. They use a patsy, and they always have. They hide the meaning of what they're doing, and they've always done that, going clear back to Rome. They mess with the language so that you don't know what you're agreeing to. You go into a courtroom, and the first thing out of somebody's mouth, are you a U.S. citizen? Well, of course I am. Bingo, you just said you're a British Commonwealth subject. Because they own the United States government from that point of view. It's a corporation. Did they ask you if you were a sovereign? No. Did they ask you if you were a state national? No. Did they ask you if you were Oregon or a New York citizen? No. Because those are different. What we are, if we don't change our status, is an incorporated body owned by a foreign government. And we've been that way since we were born. If we look at our country down through the 1800s, you'll find there were a few people who tried to point out what was going on, but they tried to hide their identity. There's a rather interesting book called Statesman 3 that I recommend, where three people connected to Congress using aliases. One's called himself, I think, the colonel. Somebody's calling himself, I think, the judge. I forget what it was, but acronyms. And they're talking about what's going on and who's being bribed and how much money's going sideways and what is really happening. And it's a criminal empire. And it's very interesting reading. They have the list of the people and how much money they're getting under the table. I remember McKinley was getting quite a bit of money. Interesting. So we haven't really had a president since Buchanan. What we've had is different people working as presidents, but they're representing foreign bodies. And there's no end to them. When this happened, and I began to read these things, it was kind of depressing, really, because it didn't look like there was any light at the end of the tunnel. How could we possibly get out of this? Our Constitution clearly says that money is gold and silver, and yet we've got this elastic military script that I was familiar with being overseas when I was in the Marine Corps. You know, it's just paper. But at the time, it represented money. But anytime they wanted to change the script, and they did, people out in town would commit suicide because all of a sudden the money they'd been hiding and keeping to themselves, especially in Japan, was worthless. Snap of a finger. I think the closest relationship to it that I could see was when J.P. Morgan came in with these rich buddies pretending to shore up Wall Street, actually satisfied the bankruptcy and reset the corporation back on foreign ownership. I think he had a checkbook also from foreign government. I wouldn't be a bit surprised. But in 1907, they satisfied that bankruptcy, and they decided, JP and his buddies, that they needed to be able to get their money back somewhere. So they had a secret meeting 3 years later on Jekyll Island on his hunting lodge. And they brought people in from the banking community, and they brought speakers in from Europe, and they designed a plan whereby they would take over the American money supply clandestinely with this Federal Reserve idea and They all agreed on how to do it. And to make it look like it's a federal bureaucrat or a bureaucracy, they gave it a federal name, which is like Federal Express, something like that. It didn't mean a thing, but people didn't know. We didn't have the internet. We couldn't communicate as fast as we can now. It took them a while to get somebody to get it through Congress because, see, you have to actually pass the Federal Reserve Act to make it possible to go around the Constitution. Congress has to do this. Well, how do they do it? They would never get it done. First of all, they had to have a president in the White House that they could manipulate. A banking family doesn't mean that everybody in the family is a banker. And Wilson was one of those people. He was a professor at Princeton. And he got the nod to be the president for the Democratic Party. His family was a banking family, yes, but he wasn't. And he was very easily distracted because they got him involved in this League of Nations thing and his 14 points, and he was just so busy into himself that he didn't notice that his chief of staff, a guy named House, was actively working to get the Federal Reserve Act passed. And if you've ever read stuff by House, you'll see what we've got today. He was not a nice guy. Even then, they would never have made it. Taft would have been reelected, except they got Teddy Roosevelt to come out of the woodwork and form up another party called the Bull Moose Party, split the Republican ticket, and the Democrats walked right in. And Wilson didn't even know he's being used. So while he's running around being really fond of himself and talking about his 14 points and all of this stuff, even if it was whatever, it might have been a very nice idea, he wasn't seeing what was being done in his own backyard. And finally, on 1913, they adjourned Congress for the holidays. Everybody got on trains and went home. They didn't realize Congress hadn't been closed. And they stayed behind, a small group of people, and reopened Congress while everybody was gone and passed the Federal Reserve Act. That's how it got in. And then when they came back, they all got money. And they've been getting money ever since, under the table. And they keep on passing the Federal Reserve Act and keep right on running our fiat currency as a military script. Problem with that whole thing is that back in Lincoln's time, you remember General Order 100? I read the whole thing. It's about 156 or so articles. It's a big, long thing. There's 2 of them in there that's really important. Lincoln was evidently quite disenchanted with what had been going on his watch when he really saw Gettysburg. And he may have been very depressed about it, I don't know. But he put in there that the Army will, for that point forward, be responsible for protecting the people. He didn't say persons. And he knew what that meant because he's the one that put it out there as a corporation. The people and the money. And they did. They did. They started skimming off all of your tax dollars all these years, putting them in a slush fund. They did. And one of our advisors, Miss Anna, chased it down. She kind of knew that it was there, but it took her a while to find it. The DOD has it. It's a slush fund. There's about $27 trillion in it now. They've been reinvesting it right along. And maybe 5 or 6 trillion of that actually belongs to maybe a disparity in trade, some kind of an imbalance. But 21 trillion of it belongs to you. It's your money. Your fathers, your grandfathers, and great-grandfathers paid this money into this fund, and they're managing it for you. However, they can only give it to Americans. Because when they were put to the task and they finally admitted they had the money, they said, we can't release it because there's no Americans living here anymore. Everybody's a British subject. They just don't know it. So then Anna went on a warpath to get people to reclaim themselves as Americans. And she said, how many people do we need for you to listen to us? Because we want the money now. She wants to restart our republic again. It's been dead since 1860. Well, they gave her a figure like 160,000. Then we'll talk. That's still a small number in a nation our size. Last year, she floated a balloon and decided she'd try it. She didn't have that many people, but she thought I'd run it through and see what would happen. So she gathered all of her people in the assemblies at that time, and they put all of their debts together and gave those debts back to the government to be offset against their own assets that the DOD owned for them. And every single person got paid. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in mortgages, in student loans, erased. Snap of a finger. No problem, it's there. So then around the first official first round, I'm ahead of the line. I didn't have much. I had a credit card debt from some medical stuff, but you know, $15,000 is kind of small next to people that have $500,000 or $600,000 and stuff. Nobody got paid. Why? Well, it just happens that we're going through our fourth bankruptcy under Obama. He put us into bankruptcy. He didn't want to. He was forced to it. The Community of Nations again. And he had to go Chapter 7 on the municipal corporation. And in the process of doing that, the territorial got away with a Chapter 11. They can be reorganized. And the whole idea was that this whole big shuffle then messed up these government offices. And they said they can't deal with any of these offset credits because now they're in flux themselves. Well, as soon as Obama left, and people in the Pentagon who had been working on this problem for quite a long time, ever since JFK was assassinated, there's been people in the Pentagon knew very well what went on in this country, but they were in the minority. And when they got to Watergate, they were furious. There was a big faction of military in our Pentagon that wanted to stage a coup, and they came right out and said so. Except the more prevailing, older, seasoned minds said, please, let's not do that. The reasoning being very simple. The world has come to see our Constitution as the most unique, maybe for the first time ever in history, and certainly on the planet, document ever. And if you use a military coup to restore it, it'll make it look like anybody else's documents. It'll be like another banana republic having a revolutionary Friday. It'll lose all of its historical momentum, its respect. Use the constitutions to clean up the house. Use them. And they didn't know how. A fella came out of the woodwork some time ago. Maybe 5 years ago. He used the pseudonym Drake, and he was a former intelligence officer in the Pentagon who knew a lot of these people. But he also knew about the sovereign thing. And he says, states are sovereign nations. They should reestablish that status with the Hague now. And he said so on David Wilcock's show one night, and somebody in Pennsylvania heard that. And then the Pentagon called him. He was in retirement and said, hey, buddy, I'm going to send a staff car over. We need to talk. And he said, are you going to put me in the trunk? No. He says, you're coming to my house. And in his own words, a long video, he said, I spent the night there looking at all of this preparation for the coup happening in the Watergate times. And now, he said, you were on the radio. Yeah. And you said something about state sovereignty, that you could reestablish that. Yeah. Well, somebody was listening. Pennsylvania has just filed to reestablish the fact that they are a sovereign nation. Can we do that? They were clueless. He said, well, yes. And they did it for every state. So then we're on a kind of a road where the military's kind of going on one road, and we're over here with the assemblies going on the other road. But it's the same road, except it's not organized enough to overcome what we now call the deep state, which is a great criminal empire that's worldwide, that controls the money, controls a lot of the military, and way deep into the politics of every nation on the planet. And they own the media. And I talk to people about that. I say, you know, you listen to the nightly news, but have you ever actually looked to see where this comes from? I happen to know something about that. Soon after 9/11, a guy came into Eugene. I had never heard of him before, but he was very, very popular in England. He was the nightline guy like Ted Koppel on the BBC at night. His name was Greg Palast. And he was at the McDonald Theater in Eugene. And he said, I started out under the Justice Department as a mole inside of crime families to find out who's doing what to who, when, and where. In other words, he said, I was a disguise. And of course, if they caught me, they'd have just shot me. And every time I'd find something pertinent and send it out there, it never made it to the nightly news. And it kind of ticked me off. I'm the one going to get the bullet, and they won't even in their plush little offices even mention it. So when they had a convention of anchormen, he went. And in his own words, on that stage, he said, I got in their face big time. Jennings, Koppel, Rather, they were all there. I said, here I am out there getting ready to get shot for this, and you won't even air it on the news. And to a man, they said this: we're all scripted. If we said anything like that, we'd be out of work by morning. We're not allowed to say that. We're all scripted. And he said, and I knew right then and there was no hope here. So I left America and I went to Britain. And I asked the BBC because I had done some research. And he said, and the BBC does not have anyone funding it. It's got a private trust. So they have actually a law against donating money to the BBC. It's a felony. That's a good start. So I get involved with them and I put on my disguises. They know me as the man with a hat. I go into offices and I pull out documents that don't exist and I put them on the air at night and people love me. I damn near he said, I tried to topple the Tony Blair government and almost did. It was called Lobbygate. I showed the British people that access to their government was only if they paid for it. And then the BBC called me in. It says, Greg, we love you, but we can't afford you. There's no tort laws in England. Even if you're innocent, you got to pay. And they had thousands of lawsuits coming out of Parliament. And they didn't have a big enough war chest. And so he said I had to leave. So I went back to California. Wrote a couple of books. I haven't kept up with him now, but at the time he was here, it opened my eyes to the idea that we don't have any news. And I kind of suspected that for quite a long time, but we don't have any news. We have propaganda. And you got to go outside of that. Well, now we have the tools to go anywhere we want because the media now can't keep up with the internet because we can talk too fast now. Our fathers may have been forgiven. Who can afford to go somewhere and look through libraries when you're working from 9 to 5 in a job somewhere feeding your family? You don't have time for that nonsense. Now, my dad sure didn't. And yet he knew things weren't right. But what are you going to say about it? You don't know enough and you can't go see. Now in my time with this internet thing coming out, and you can go anywhere. You can go to any museum, you can go to the Library of Congress, you can pull documents from anywhere. It's amazing what I've got. So now I have the Declaration of Interdependence. Ever hear of that one? The territorial government and the municipal government did not always like each other. You remember, the Pope is directly under the municipal, owns it, and the Queen, Lord Mayor, have the territorial. Even though they're all Pope, he owns the whole place. So it's kind of like one side of his office against the other side of his office, kind of silly. But when you look at these things, you have to somehow step back and say, what? They agreed to finally stop disagreeing in 1937, on the eve of World War II. Now, we were nowhere near the war yet. Germany had not really launched her side of the war. The Japanese had. They were in China because they had taken over Manchuria after the World War I. They were our allies then, and Germany went down, and that was their colony. And so German colony in Manchuria became a Japanese colony, Manchu. And they had launched their attack in 1936. But in 1939, on the eve of war, Hitler's inner circle had a house party and took a photograph that I have. And the photograph was in Otto Skarzeny's possession. That's Adolf Hitler's bodyguard. And the head of one of the most effective commando outfits ever in World War II. He survived the war, got a new identity, moved to Argentina, then to Brazil, finally to the Northwest. Yeah, right here. Along with Adolf Hitler. Yeah, right here. Right here. He didn't die in a bunker. And the Army always knew that guy wasn't him. They all got away. They had doubles. Martin Bormann, a journalist a few years ago, ran him down in Peru in a hospital. He has a big hacienda in Argentina. I got a picture of it. Yeah, kind of interesting. Otto Skarzny died in 1999. And he gave a box of documents to Webster Tarpley, an investigative journalist, along with these pictures and documents as to what was going on during the Nazi portion of German history. And he said the last time that the inner circle of the family got together was in 1998 in Glacier National Park. They rented a lodge, and the honored guest was Adolf Hitler at 104. He lived right here in the Northwest. We could have walked past him on the street and not even known it. That much history can be hidden if they really want to, and we've been hidden from just about everything. But the two halves of our government agreed to work together in 1937, and they have this document that I have. It's about that wide, about this long, and it's a big long thing, hard to read because it's done in kind of a script. And then there's another document just that big of everybody that signed on for it in 1937, that the two halves of our federal government, the territorial and the municipal, will work together as a team. No more butting of heads on the eve of war. They already knew they were going to war. Pearl Harbor was an inside job. We didn't know it, but a lot of people in the military suspected it until now, through Freedom of Information, we've got the documents. I've got it myself in my own desk. Franklin Roosevelt was summoned in 1940 to a rendezvous with Winston Churchill in Labrador in an icy bay. The Prince of Wales next to one of our cruisers of one type or another, and they had a secret meeting that's never been identified and no minutes were ever kept. No one knew what that meant. But now we know. Winston Churchill needed us. And he ordered Franklin Roosevelt to get his butt off the couch and start getting us ready for war because we had to go to war. They needed us. They were on the ropes. The Battle of Britain was horrible. And Franklin Roosevelt went to his military, and we've got the documents, and asked them how to do this. Well, the easiest way would be to take a bunch of ships that weren't necessarily so important, put them in a bay somewhere that couldn't be defended too well. It would be an irresistible target for the Japanese, and get them to attack it. Well, the irresistible force was all the battleships, because they were useless in World War II. They're just gun platforms. Any plane can sink one in a matter of seconds. And they sacrificed all those sailors and all those ships and made everybody furious, because I remember it well myself, absolutely furious that the Japanese would do that to us after we'd been doing tin can drives and stuff for their lack of metal. My dad used to say, well, we had metal runs and we sent it over there, and then now they're throwing it back at us, which is exactly what happened. And then, of course, we had a day of infamy because the Japanese had a point, And I've been on that side of it. I know them well. They had an ultimatum, and they tried to present it before the attack took place, except that somehow or other it wasn't allowed to go through. The ambassadors got the message and then couldn't find a way of typing it up because all the typewriters disappeared. And they're running around trying to put this document together, and in the process, Pearl Harbor happens. By the time they get the document together, by design, it finally gets put on Franklin Roosevelt's desk after the attack had already taken place. We got the ultimatum. In other words, it's a sneak attack, and that's all it took for the American people to be really angry. He designed it as a sneak attack because he needed it that way. We were so against war in the 1930s, we hated it. World War I was the end of it for us. And he declared war on everybody. The day of infamy. Except a lot of sailors bought the day that day. And some of those that I know that were there at the time have never forgotten it. My own uncle, who ran a landing craft throughout the Pacific as an Army officer eventually, he said, we snookered the Japanese to get into that war. Everybody knew it. There was no sneak attack. We set it up. There wasn't a single carrier in there, and that was the most important part. Then we went right to war with them, went into the Coral Sea. They say that was a stalemate, but no, we came out of that pretty good. We lost the Lexington out of it, but it was only because they couldn't put the fire out. They didn't know how to chip paint yet, and they had a 1/4 inch of paint on everything, and once it got going, they couldn't stop it. So we put it down with torpedoes ourselves. It's sitting on the bottom straight up with an Avenger sitting on the deck still. I just got some beautiful pictures of it the other day. And then it wasn't a month later or so, midway, we pretty well destroyed and broke their back right there, and the rest of it was just a mop-up time. Getting the B-29s into Japan was just a matter of protecting their flights, so we needed to take out all the airstrips along the way, and that's was their island hopping campaign, was anywhere they had an airstrip, like Peleliu and Tarawa and Iwo Jima, any of these places that had an airstrip that they could use, we took away from them so that we could run our flights. And even then, we couldn't hit anything. There's a jet stream across Japan that's pretty powerful, and dropping a bomb from high altitude, a B-29 could drop a bomb from 30,000 feet, and it went way off target. The Japanese were having a lot of fun laughing at us because we couldn't hit anything. Curtis LeMay thought he'd cut a fat hog by coming in between the AAA. They had a AAA gap between about, I think it was 15,000 to 20,000 or 25,000. There was a band in there that wasn't covered. You had high X and they had lower X, but the AAA didn't have this one band. And so he flew the B-29s through there. And it was going to be daylight precision bombing. Except the Japanese kind of knew they would do that. So they stripped a bunch of planes down, no armament at all, and suicided them right into the belly of these things and took out 6 B-29s in the first run. Now, they were willing to die for their country, misled as they were at the time, but I do understand them. And I knew a lot of people who were involved in the suicide squadrons that were saved by the bomb. And I know that the bomb had to happen because 250,000 American prisoners were going to be executed later that month. And they had to stop the war, and they had to do it right now. And Truman had no option. And then the question was the Manhattan Project successful, and was that our bomb? And I say, no, it isn't. I don't think so. I have a letter from Oppenheimer in 1945, January, that simply said we can't build it. We simply don't have enough of the right material. We can't build it to FDR. And yet we ended up with 3 bombs. 1 at Trinity and then 2 on the war. The Germans defected with a boat that had all of those, plus a Messerschmitt 262 and some Japanese officers. They defected to us, and we kept it a secret. I think it was German bombs. They blew one up in 1944. I got a picture of it, demonstrating it for Mussolini. So, what we think we know about history probably isn't. It's been that way forever. What's the answer? The assembly. It is your government. It is your government. But you've got to sit down. The chairs were built. They've all been provided. The blueprint is there. All we have to do is occupy the chairs and run the government. But we've been away without leave since 1860. You can't let the hired help run the show anymore. You can see where it's going. And we got to kick these foreign interests out. They don't belong here anymore. We're a very wealthy nation. And yes, some of the round one have had their bills paid now. Some of them got their stuff run. I haven't got mine paid. But the money is yours. It's there. And it's just one of many trust funds. The Bar Association has a $127 trillion lien against them in the world court. And it's been accepted and they've got it. For a couple $100, you can add your name to the plaintiff list. They've got a lot to answer for. But they're fighting tooth and nail to stop us from accomplishing this. Our only answer is to fill our assemblies and start taking over our government. We have the authority, we have the legal right, we need the guns at the door and the security. Militias have to be under the sheriff's direction and trained by the sheriff, under the county government, which is you, in your county assembly. That's what we're about. Putting the right paperwork together, declaring yourself an American now, not a British, and sitting down in the chairs and simply doing the job. And I think we can do it. I just didn't know how before. To summarize it all, things that happened early on in Europe affect what happens to us right now today because of the way the law and order and legal systems have been manipulated throughout the years. Originally, we had a sovereign or aristocratic overlord in almost every country of one kind or another. The famous revolution in France was just one example of people being united through pain and deciding that they didn't want any more of this and cut everybody's heads off with guillotines. But that caused chaos, and then a military guy comes in, like, I guess from the sidelines, the Corsican, with cannon, and seizes the government by military coup. Well, those years produced in our country our formative years of getting our government actually running, even though it was started even before that. And what we had were people who are very intelligent, struggling with one another to figure out how to make this thing work, knowing what the world was. Aristocrats were above everybody else. The land people outnumbered everyone by a great deal, but were very disorganized, illiterate, the unwashed masses. In the end of the 1700s, you'll find that in the German universities, there was a very famous philosopher named Hegel, and he created what became known as the Hegelian dialectic. Hegel said that nobody has any value unless it's given by the state, that no one has any value at all unless the state recognizes you as having value and bestows it upon you. So you must work for the state. His biggest criticizer, I guess you would say, was a guy who pointed out to people that if you do that, they will outnumber you and you will unify them through their pain. Karl Marx. Karl Marx said that. And once the unwashed masses, through pain, are unified, they will tear your house down in a violent revolution. That's the Communist Manifesto. He wasn't saying he liked communism. What he was saying was, if you capitalists abuse your power, you will unify the masses through pain, and they will erupt. And they do. except that we put labor unions in to kind of balance it out through the years. But there was some times when it was very painful. They used the state police to protect themselves, these capitalists. So you get these very, very rich steel men and railroad men, the Rockefellers and the rest of them. And eventually, people won't take it anymore. That's what really happened. When you have Trotsky and Lenin running around then trying to promote that sort of thing, they got thrown out of Russia. And until the Tsar was assassinated along with his family, they weren't even allowed in the country. But they got right on the train and went right back over. As soon as they got there, the first thing they did was take over communication. They only had Moscow, but they took down the communication. They ran the communication. And with communication, they can control the emotions of the people. And then you end up with what they called communist country. And of course, he got disposed by Stalin, who was one of his henchmen. That's not communism. Communism was more successful right here in Oregon. What they've got is a totalitarian dictatorship. Just a group of people instead of a single guy, yeah. So there's not that much difference between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. They both killed all their people off. But in Oregon here, we have a real communist history. Kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing because they also had polygamy and everybody else going over. It's just Aurora, the foundation of Aurora. That's where it came from. That was a communist society. And here we call it labor unions that have become farmers' unions. I belonged to it when I was a kid. Well, we don't call it communism, but it's what it really amounts to, where everybody belongs to the center. The center has therefore enough money to buy machinery that then everybody can rent really cheaply that they could never afford to buy on their own. Combines and stuff like that when I was a kid, too expensive. So most people couldn't afford them. But a bunch of farmers together could buy a combine, and then go around and do everybody's fields. And the Mount Angel Farmers Union was a place I hung out all the time. Even when I got out of the service, I went over there with a truckload of grain that happened to be left over from my dad's silo. And I bought some pigs over at the Woodburn auction and went over there with a couple 300 pounds of just barley. And the Farmers Union had the grist mill right there, the hammer mill, and they just threw it through there for a couple dollars, and I had mash. And I fed them out, butchered the pigs. We had enough meat for a year. Go down to the Lake LaBiche where they were doing potatoes next to the onions. Walk in there where all the women are sorting the potatoes, and I asked, you got any calls? Well, yeah, they got some under. Well, there's 300 pounds over there. You can have them. I'll need 6 bits for the sacks, however. So I paid 25 cents a hundred for potatoes, 1963. We're fixed. We got pork. We had chickens. We got potatoes. We're good to go. Because it was January and February, along in there when I got home. I got out of service right at the end of 62. And that's what a community is like when you live in the country. Everybody has a piece, and they work as a team. And so I guess your grange halls and things of that nature were the fabric of this country in the countryside for the farmers. So when you see these things being uprooted by corporate interests that are actually more beholden to a foreign government than they are to you, it's no wonder that our country has been torn apart and turned upside down and inside out. But they can't stop the original idea because it's not incorporated. It's the Union Trust of nation states. We're not subordinate to the government. We're senior to the government. It was only the state of states that were junior to the government. They were just incorporated franchises. And that's what Oregon is right now, state of Oregon. It's an incorporated franchise of a bankrupted government. So actually, we don't have any government. They're just pretending. Well, if we sit down in our chairs and start running our assemblies like the founders started out with, and really do the work for the first time in 160 years, you know what? we can fill the ranks of the real sheriff, and the real sheriff can give us security so we can sit our grand jury, the real grand jury, and not the thing they call a grand jury now, and have a public court, a common law court of American-style common law where the jury decides, of your peers, decides the issue. And the last thing they want to do is put somebody in prison where they have to feed them. They want to satisfy the whole issue right there. An example I was given. John goes across the fence with a shotgun and blows Joe's head off. And there's no question about who did it. He goes before the grand jury because all capital crime in this country under the Constitution has to be seen by a grand jury. But that's the people's grand jury, not the thing they call a grand jury now. The real grand jury. And the jurors can question and pursue any avenue of questioning they want to find out what the truth is. And it comes out that John doesn't even deny it. He did it, yeah. But they look at his history and he's been an upstanding citizen his whole life. What happened? So through the examination and all the question and answer, they find out that Joe over there came across the fence and raped his daughter, came back the next day, raped his wife, shot his cow, set his barn on fire, set his fields on fire. And you know what? John snapped. And the jurors all say, you know, I would have too. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear you'll never do this again the rest of your life? I so swear. Dismissed. It's done. They don't even give a true bill. It doesn't even go to court. The grand jury finds out this is justified, everything was fine. It's really your peers that decide what you have done. And it's a local, county, community process. The federal government, our corporations providing services for you, and these enumerated services have been designed for a long time, but they're pretty simple. And when they get out of line, you have the right to change them. And you may not, as an assembly in a state, meet very often. Maybe January every year you meet for 2 weeks. And you review the whole operation for the last year of your legislative assembly, which is a county thing under the state of. And you see, well, you know, they did pretty good here, did pretty good there, but, you know, this has got to change. You can annul it with the stroke of a pen. Anything they do, you can annul. You can fire them, for that matter. And they have committed treason right now. They've taken the Oregon Constitution, for example, and they've made it a book of statutes. When I was a kid, I got one. When I was 10 years old, about this big, maybe that thick, the Oregon Constitution. And it's called the State of Oregon Constitution. Same name, except it was not incorporated at that time. It became State of Oregon Incorporated Constitution later. And then the legislature, in the incorporated side, modified it by adding statutes to it. That's treason. The Oregon legislature does not have the authority to modify or amend even the Oregon Constitution. The only body of politics that can modify or amend a constitution is the Assembly. No one else has the authority to do that because only live men, live women, as sovereigns on the land, have the authority to do that. The legislature is just a bunch of hired help, like your people take care of your lawn. They have no authority to do that, but they did it. So I'm waiting for the day when we have enough security to seat the grand jury on the second floor of the Capitol building in Salem. And the state police are not there anymore because they've been told to stand down because they're your employees. And our people are now at the door, the marshals and the sheriffs and the militia, under the sheriff's direction, the well-organized militia. And I get to walk down the center aisle as marshal. I'm marshal of the assembly right now. I've been elected. And face our legislatures with the Constitution that they've bastardized in my hand. Fellas, we have to have a talk. And we don't have to walk very far to give the warrants out because the grand jury's meeting on the floor above. The point is, we don't want to butt heads. They've been doing things out of ignorance for years. But if we, as an assembly, can bring them back into a lawful direction and make sure that they stay on the track, and the republic is now in operation, we can fix all of this. But we need security at the door. Right now, the state police takes care of the Capitol building. I can walk through there with a gun, but it has to be concealed, and I have to have a concealed permit from the sheriff, which is a county sheriff. Well, on the door, it'll say no firearms allowed, but on print that big, it'll say unless you have a permit. The fact is, under the real Oregon Constitution, you have the right to carry a firearm anywhere, anytime, any place. There's no restriction. It's in your Constitution, not the national one, Oregon's. And it doesn't even mealy-mouth itself with organized militia. They're talking about for personal defense. And I got that originally from one of our county commissioners down in Lane County. So I checked it out. Darned if it wasn't true. But it has to be exposed. Under the current law, you can carry it exposed. Having said that, we have to be good citizens. You must respect private property. You don't go walking into somebody's restaurant carrying a firearm on your hip without some good reason to have it there. If you had a Smokey Bear hat and a badge, yeah. But if you go in there looking like that, you're going to scare somebody. They're going to call the local police. They may not be able to actually do anything, but the proprietor can file a complaint because he's private property. We have to respect that. But on the street, no. In Albany a while back, some kids had an AR-15 on their shoulder walking around town. And the cop kept stopping him. Well, they videoed it. The video was cute to watch. And the cop walks up, he's the sheriff, and he's, boys, I see your weapon? Nope. Tell you what, if you let me see yours, I'll let you see mine. And mine's a better one than yours because he had a more up-to-date AR-15 or something sitting in the squad car. He says, no, you're going to try to take it away from me. He says, no, I won't. I know you can carry it around, but boys, this is the deal. Every block you walk, some parent is going to call us, and we, by law, must respond. And we're going to just keep hassling you, and what's the use? I know what you're saying, but maybe this isn't the place. And I saw that, and at that time I was still chairman of the Oath Keepers in Oregon, so I thought, well, okay. I had a carry permit, so I could disguise mine, keep it inside the belt. And we had the Chattanooga attempted assassination of our recruiters in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and it was kind of a hot item for a little while, and we decided to do guard duty on our own people right there in Eugene. And a former police officer, a state trooper that was SWAT team trained and retired, former Coast Guard, and in my assembly there, the Oath Keepers, we went over there, civilian clothes, nothing showing. But two kids had showed up the day before in full camo with 250-round magazine drums on their 16s, strutting around in a shopping mall in front of the recruiting offices for the Air Force, Army, Navy, Marine Corps. And so that wasn't going to be tolerated. The door shakers that had the contract was out of Salem, and they sent down word to the local guys doing the local security there that if they had anybody there in uniform pretending to be a cop, they would pull the contract. And so those guys come up, and the kids, we'd sent them home, told them to go grow up. And Roger and I are sitting there, you know, and this guy walks up and says, I want to talk to whoever's doing security here, and you might talk to us. And he showed us what happened. He said, I'm going to lose my job if you guys are walking around here with firearms, because my boss says if that's the case, they cancel the contract. They're not going to have nothing to do with this. I said, no, we're on the same page. Well, there were some kids here. I said, yeah, but we sent them home. And finally I stood up. He says, well, am I causing a problem? Well, no. Well, I got the full 9 yards. Oh. And then Roger stood up and says, I'm insane. Well, if that's the way you'll do it, that's fine. It's just what people see that bothers us. And so it was a matter of respecting the private property, even though we'd talked to all the owners and they were in favor of it. But the public, if a woman and her child is going into a Albertsons store, and the kid's going, Mom, he's got a gun, and all that kind of stuff. That kind of stress doesn't have to be in a marketplace. So you have to stop and make common sense. If it's out of sight, you can still be a good guard. The next thing was, okay, when something does happen and we intervene, and then the cops come around the corner, how do they know who's who? And I was thankful that I had a SWAT team trained former state policeman with me. And he says, this is how you do it. And he demonstrated it. Put your hand in the air like this and place your gun on the ground. And remain completely non-combative until they find out who you are. They're instructed not to shoot you if you do that. So even though you might have your gun out and have somebody down that's a terrorist, as soon as they show up, turn it over to them. Turn it over to them. Let them do their job. And so we practiced that. But the bottom line was that the Oath Keepers are trying to do something they learned from the military, and I had the same training. And it wasn't going to get anything done unless they put on a suit and tie and go to the halls of Congress, so to speak, at Salem, and meet with the legislators and have a talk at lunch and get something done that matters. Because you're not getting anything done running around looking like you're a terrorist yourself, hiding in a duck blind, pretending you're a militiaman. That's not going to get it done. All that's got to do is make people annoyed with you. And so the Oath Keepers and I disagreed, and I resigned. And I was trying to make heads of what to do next when I got this curious little email. Because I had said something about we have to do something this way and that way and so forth, and I was thinking more on the political side to get something done. And this strange email from some woman named Anna Von Ritz. And she said, that's all well and good, boys, but you have no clue what you're doing and no idea what you're up against. And then there's this long dialogue about what we've been talking about today. And who in the hell is this? But then I found out that she has stuff that I could read. And the next thing you know, I find there's a guy named Stramer up in Montana that'll give me every stuff as it comes out, but all this stuff is on record. And I started studying, and everything she said was what I knew in my heart had to be done, but I didn't know the details. I didn't know about the multiple constitutions and their reason for being there and what was going on. I didn't know that. And I still wish that the Oath Keepers themselves would maybe learn a little bit. I had people come in and talk back when I belonged to the Liberty Alliance group, and before I found out that that was just a bunch of bar attorneys that were running them into the ground. They got nothing done. We had an incident down in Josephine County where BLM was going to come in and burn up the miners' buildings, and we went down there and did guard duty on it and told the BLM to stand down and let it go into court, and they finally did, because we had 100 men down there. And so we were kind of basking in our success picture, and then the Malheur thing happened over at Burns. Well, I knew something about Burns. My grandfather grew up there, so I kind of kept an eye on it. They were there in the middle of the winter, and it was an area that was never part of any particular Indian tribe. It was a place where all the Indian tribes hunted birds, because in the wintertime, Malheur and Harney Lake fill up. There's no outlet. And the birds coming in on the migration landed there, and they would use bow and arrow. And the arrows had little bird heads on them, and if they missed, it would float away. The wind would blow them, and on one side with the prevailing wind, you'd find a lot of arrowheads. They weren't desecrating anybody, but they came out of the militia movement, and Lavoy Fennekin got himself murdered in public with a drone in the air to make sure everybody saw it. And I was pretty angry about that, but I didn't know what was going wrong. I couldn't figure out why. This all costs money. Why? Why would they go to such trouble? And who are they? So I had to keep looking. And as a result, somebody came forward and said, if you want to know what's going on in Malheur, go back 3 years and look at the New York Times, because everybody on the East Coast knows about it, and always has. But nobody out here knows a damn thing. And so I did. I got the New York Times, I got the Wall Street Journal, and I found out all you have to do is Google Hammond, Clinton, uranium, and malaire. Just those 4 words. And all this stuff comes up. And you find out that Hillary Clinton sold the uranium reserve that happens to be in the Malaire area to the Russians through a Canadian firm and got a $100 million down payment on the sale for her war chest to run for president. And she had to get the people off the land. So the Hammonds were the first target, and then the Bundys got involved in it. Same thing down there. But then when they killed Lavoie like that, that kind of put a burr under my saddle, and I joined a bunch of guys up in Grays Harbor, Washington, that called themselves a Patriot Group. I still didn't know enough. I was reading on it, but I hadn't got enough under my belt yet. And his name was James. James wanted me to start a group for him down here, and he gave me some things to do and to get that from the county clerk. Okay. And so I made a letter requesting this material, insurances, who's their liability insurance package for the county and all that kind of stuff. And I thought I'd run it by my attorney friend. He was a student of mine once, and I said, "What do you think about this?" And he said, he wrote me back. He says, "Bob, who's the target here?" A curious thing to say. I don't know yet, you know. But then I found out that everything in Oregon under the law is incorporated. It's copyrighted. And it can't be used in court unless you have a bar number. The Bar Association owns Oregon from wall to wall. You can't do anything unless you're a bar member. Even if you can find a precedent in a law library, you can't take it into court. You got to have a bar number in order to use that stuff. It's copyrighted. Not in Washington, but in Oregon it is. But in the aftermath of the Lavoie murder, Shauna Cox and Victoria were interviewed and made some writs up, very nice writs, because there's some people in James's group up there that were one was a judge, helped him write the writs, and I have a copy of them. And she described what happened in the car that day. And Lavoie sacrificed himself to save the girls. That's simply what happened. Because when they got stopped on the road going up over the pass and they were on their way, they ran into a roadblock and they were held there for half an hour before finally he stuck his head out the window and yelled at the state trooper, "What are you doing? What's going on?" And a round hit the top of the car. And Lavoie said, "They mean to shoot us and they mean to kill us. Get down on the floor." And he floorboarded that car right up the pass on his way over to Grant County. He wanted to get the sheriff over there because he was a common law sheriff. And they had a roadblock set up for him. And then the rest everybody saw. I asked Roger, who was a SWAT team trained policeman, state police, I says, "Is that what you were trained to do?" And he says, "Absolutely not." I said, "Well, that's what I was trained to do. I recognize the whole operation. That's military. That has nothing to do with state police. So who are these guys?" So we had to check that out. Oh yeah, they came out of South France. They put on FBI uniforms. They did the whole thing, made the hit, left. They're back in France the next day. And everybody thinks it was the state police that did it. That's what you're up against. So we have to take them serious. They will do bad things. And because of that, I got very interested in this assembly business. And I was the only one that had my paperwork done. And they drafted me to be the coordinator. I don't have the electronics at my fingertip like we need because there's an awful lot of communication going on. And then I got Daryl Gilson, who came out of Hawaii, who had been the coordinator there, who had all that equipment but was physically infirm in the sense he couldn't travel like I can. So I'm on the ground running around doing this. And he's with all of the space age looking stuff. It looks like a cockpit of an airplane, doing all of the recording. So right now, you can declare yourself an American national with all the proper paperwork. And if you do the whole thing, it's going to be about 11 pages. And he can scan that stuff into the public domain, just like the county courthouse can. And it'll only cost you $25 for the scanning and about $35 for your credential card that you'll get back in the mail, laminated. And in that credential card, there's logos in there that can only be seen under a scanner. And he showed me his, and it's impressive. You put that under a scanner, and the first thing that pops up, American National, do not stop, do not detain. Lifetime permit to carry a firearm. Then you go down a little further and there's links. And as you touch on a link, up comes your whole paper. Next link, up comes your whole paper. The whole thing is right there for any judge, any law officer, any cop, anybody who needs to see it. And that card supersedes your passport. It's global. It supersedes any driver's license, because all these licenses and things you have all say you're a corporation. And this one says, oh no. And you don't need any of those others. You do not need a license plate on your car. That's a con game. You never needed that. Only if you're a commercial vehicle. In Oregon, under ODOT, you had to have a license if you're commercial, but not if you're just a private conveyance. And the word motor vehicle is a commercial vehicle, and you've been taught to say that your car is a motor vehicle. It's not. It's a personal conveyance. A motor vehicle is a commercial object. So it goes on and on and on. There's a lot of things to do that you can do, and when you're stopped by a cop, you just show him your card, he scans it, or if he doesn't scan it, so you better scan it. And he may say, well, I want your driver's license registration. No, you want this. Eventually, somebody will scan it. And all of a sudden, he'll come back, have a nice day, because he doesn't want to touch this. Yes?